Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the graphic novel apostle.
Hello, and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Orenberger, and I'm happy to be here with you as always this Monday morning. It's one of our in-between weeks, and so we've got a mini-episode today where I'd like to feature two books, one called Stand Still and the second called Jane Jett. But before we get there, I first want to thank my guest Hannah from last week once again. Our discussion of Art Brut was so much fun. I really enjoyed doing that episode. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that one yet, I highly encourage you to go back and check it out. Hannah brought so much cool background and context to our discussion of the book Art Brut, which was a comic I already loved. Really enjoyed that episode. But now let's talk about today. We've got Stand Still, issue number 1 first. So let me go through the credits on that book. The story and also the color work was done by Loughridge. Art was done by Andrew Robinson. Letters by Rob Tweedie. And it was published by Image Comics. When issue 1 of this book came out about 2 weeks ago, it was not on my radar. I hadn't heard anything about it, didn't know anything about it. But when I walked into the store on Wednesday afternoon at my local comic shop to pick up the books that I did have on my pull list for that week, the store manager, who I've gotten to know pretty well over the last couple of years and certainly knows my tastes as well in books, said, "Hey, Mark, go over and take a look at this book called Stand Still on the shelf. It wasn't on your pull list, but it's one that I think you might like." So I went over and picked it up, and I noticed right away, Loughridge is a name that's very familiar to me as a color artist. I'm not aware of whether he's done any work previously as a writer, but he's the writer of this book, and I wanted to check out what his work would look like. Also, Andrew Robinson was not an artist I was familiar with, but as I picked up that book and just thumbed through the pages, his art is spectacular. And apparently for those who knew him already, it was no surprise that his art would just be great in this book. But there was also another reason that it sort of stood out to me as something a little different. This book is done entirely in double-page spreads. Now, it's an oversized issue in terms of its length. It's about 60 pages. This is issue 1 of what's going to be 8 issues in a mini-series. And apparently all of them are going to be done in this format, where every page you're encountering a double-page spread, and it ends up running about 60 pages per issue. Really fantastic to look at. And as always, on our Instagram page, @GraphicNovelApostle, we'll have a couple of samples of the art. This week, we're actually going to sort of reverse the way I present the art from the 2 books we're going to discuss. So the art from Jane Jett will be featured first, but later down, if you slide through the images on our Instagram post, you'll see some of the artwork from Stand Still. So let me read you the description of this book from Image Comics that they put in their announcement back in May about this book that I guess I just completely missed. But here's how Image Comics presented it. In Stand Still, readers meet Ryan Rule, an enigmatic, lecherous, and clinically insane sociopath who has stolen a top-secret device that can freeze time. Now, as the bodies of world leaders pile up, famous works of art go missing, and other strange crimes dominate the headlines, only the device's creator, a run-of-the-mill science geek, knows what's happening and sets out to stop Riker's seemingly endless revenge tour. So I'll tell you, that description gives us a lot more of the story than what we get in issue 1. After reading issue 1 and not having first seen that description, I was still kind of puzzling exactly what our story is going to be, but I could tell it was going to be a fun story. So let's talk about it. This first issue begins with a cold open that introduces Riker to us. In fact, it wasn't until I read that description that I even knew his name was Riker. I don't think it's given in the first issue. But as we meet him, he's strolling into a dangerous-looking biker bar, and he's wearing a Hawaiian shirt, shorts, sandals with socks. He's got one of those long cigarette holders like the Penguin, if you think about the Burgess Meredith version of Penguin from the 1966 Batman show, how he always had that cigarette. And he's wearing this giant bracelet as well that's got like this circular center that has some kind of either a screen or a gem on it. It's hard to tell a little bit at first. But as he goes in, he just starts trash talking to the bartender and all the bikers in this bar, and it seems like this is a biker bar for one specific motorcycle club. But it gets their attention as well, and so all eyes are on this wildly dressed guy who is really trash-talking their bartender, and he's obviously rustling some feathers. In fact, we get to the point where they grab this guy and they put him up against the wall, and it looks like these bikers are getting ready to just beat him down. And meanwhile, Riker is carrying on the whole time like he doesn't have a care in the world. So just as they're getting ready to pummel him, he disappears. Now, he doesn't just disappear, but the bartender, who seemed to have been the ringleader of this assault that was getting ready to take place, finds himself confused, not knowing what happened to the guy, but then also realizing that he's got a bloody knife in his hand, and as we pan back and look around, the entire bar is covered with the bodies of dead bikers. Well, we turn the page then to see Riker, and he's standing on a rooftop and he's talking on a cell phone. We don't know who he's talking to, but he's explaining to the person on the other end of the line that those bikers had suffered an appropriate revenge for something that they had done to someone who was important to the person on the other end of the phone. So this gives us our first little taste of who Riker is. Later in the issue, we're going to see Riker in one of these all-night diners, and he's having a conversation with the waitress in there. And he asks her, if you could stop time, what wouldn't you do? So she starts to talk about how, she'd walk into a bank and she'd take out all the money while time was stopped and then not have to work the waitress job anymore. But Riker stops her and he clarifies, he's not asking what would you do if you could stop time. He wants to know, what wouldn't you do? And this seems to be the question that's going to predominate the rest of this story. And we get the idea pretty early on that there's not a whole lot that Riker would not do, which is going to make for a very interesting tale. By the end of the first issue, we still don't really know what Riker's moral code looks like, and I think that's going to be one of the most interesting parts of the entire series. Was the revenge that he got during that cold open something that he did for money? Or was it some form of street justice? Or maybe was it a little bit of both? Later in the issue, he freezes time again, this time just so he can embarrass the passenger who's sitting next to him on an airplane flight, who had been sexually harassing the flight attendant and bragging about how he is engaged in profiteering off of poor populations in underdeveloped countries. Through this really cleverly done information dump that we get kind of in the middle of the issue as well, where the scientist who we heard about in that description of the series is doing some research on possible acts that could be traced back to this time device, we read about the following types of things: an arson, a cartel leader being murdered, a political assassination in Pakistan, and the Queen of England's dogs and jewels disappearing. So at this point, we really don't know who Riker is, how he got that device, whether there's any personal connection between him and the scientist who's going to be his antagonist throughout this series, whether Riker is working with or maybe even for somebody else. We don't know what his motivations are, and we don't know what, if anything, Riker wouldn't do. I think discovering that is going to be a ton of fun. I'm looking forward to carrying on with this series. So next I want to talk about Jane Jett, Book 1, which is called Nuclear Shadows. The credits for this book, the writer, letterer, and co-creator is Amal Desai, art and co-creation for the story by Paul Essenson, colors by Giuliana Malfa, and then inking was done by several different artists, and this book was published by a company called Markosia. This is a short original graphic novel, so it was never serialized first. It goes directly to us as about 50 pages of story with maybe another 15 pages of back matter that includes a pinup gallery, some early character sketches from artist Paul Essenson, an information page about the public domain characters that inspired the characters we'll see in this book, and, importantly, there's a page of historical information that sheds light on a lot of things that happen in the plot. I'm going to come back to that in just a bit, but first I want to talk a little bit about how I even came to see this book. Amal Desai, whose name I read off just a moment ago as the co-creator and the writer of this book, as well as the letterer, reached out to me on Instagram, and he was kind enough to send me a review copy of this book. And I want to say to anybody else out there who's involved in creating independent comics that has a story that you think might fit well with this podcast, I welcome that. At Graphic Novel Apostle on Instagram or by email, graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com. And I'll say with this one, it's very unlikely that I would have discovered this book otherwise. It doesn't come through the traditional direct comics market publishing. It's also not the type of book, both the story and the setting that normally I would have just naturally gravitated to, but it showed up in my inbox and I was happy to take a look at it. As I discuss this book over the next couple of minutes, please don't be surprised that this is going to be a very favorable review. And it's not because I'm flattered that somebody sent me their book, but rather when I think about what I want to do with my podcast, I want to highlight the types of things that I enjoy. I'm not Siskel and Ebert. I'm not the New York Times book review. If someone sends me a book to read and I don't like it, I might offer some feedback to the creator privately or just politely decline to review the book on the show. But I'm not going to feature a book just so I can dump on it. But I'm also not going to just prop up a book because somebody sent it to me. So if I do choose to highlight a book on one of these mini podcasts, please know that the favorable things that I say about it are genuine. And I also won't be afraid to critique a little bit here and there when I think the book is otherwise something that I felt positively enough that I wanted to feature. So after I read this book and had a little bit of time to think about it, I decided I wanted to circle back around with Amal and talk to him a little bit more about the book. An additional interest of mine is there's this huge DIY component to the independent comics universe. And I'm always interested in hearing people's stories of self-starting, about how they go from being a fan of comics to being a creator of comics, and how they're making that work. And so I wanted to talk to Amal a little bit about that process as well. So I'm going to talk about the book now for a few minutes, but after I've done that, I'm going to share with you a bit of our conversation. But first, let's talk about Jane Jett itself. If you turn over the book and look at the back cover, here's the brief description that's provided. In a dieselpunk 1955, Jane Jett hits the skies after killing her abusive husband, Rocket Man, and becoming public enemy number one. If she's to survive, she'll need to outfly the looming shadows of World War II and onslaughts from the nearly unstoppable armored heroes of this age. Jane Jett serves two fistfuls of truth and fury in Book 1, Nuclear Shadows. So, do you guys remember that movie, The Rocketeer, from 1991? It had Billy Campbell, Jennifer Connelly, Alan Arkin, Timothy Dalton, and Paul Sorvino. Look, I didn't remember all that. I looked it up as well. But when I first saw Jane Jett and looked at the cover, it instantly reminded me of The Rocketeer. That was a fun movie. And when you hear the term diesel punk in that description from a minute ago, think about that aesthetic. Jetpacks, the mid-1950s, post-World War II. What could an alternate version of technology look like? I guess that makes this somewhat of a sci-fi book. So in this world, Rocket Man and Jane Jett were partners in jetpack-propelled heroics during World War II. But now, it's 10 years later, Rocket Man and Jane Jett are retired, and they're unhappily married. Rocket Man is abusive. He might have been a national hero, but at home, he takes his anger out on Jane Jett. And where this story begins, Jane has decided that she can no longer take that abuse, and she uses Rocket Man's own jetpack to propel him straight through the wall of their house and off into the air to crash and die somewhere off panel. Having done so, Jane Jett realizes she can't just stay where she is now. She has to flee. And so she gets out her own dusty jetpack from her days in the war, and she launches off to flee from her home, knowing that she's going to be pursued by a bunch of heroes from an organization called HFP, that's Heroes for Freedom and Peace, which seems to be an operation that's either a part of or supported by the U.S. government. The HFP develops weaponry that's unique for heroes that are scattered throughout the U.S. Now, when I say heroes, don't think of superpowers. These are ordinary people. Think instead about armor, about extreme and outlandish weapons that identify each of these heroes. This is going back to that diesel punk element of the story. So we'll meet characters like the Fist of Peace. He has a giant metal fist that launches off his arm like a rocket. Cannons of Courage, who has this big mounted machine gun. And Sword of Justice, who has a giant flaming sword that he uses to attack his enemies. Jane Jett is going to encounter each of these hero opponents as she flees from the HFP and from what she's done. So here's another odd twist. The HFP, it's run by Nazis. Now, this is the point where on my first read through the story, I felt like it kind of jumped the shark a little bit. I thought, okay, I can believe in the jetpack heroes. I can believe in the elaborate armor and weaponry. But it's post-World War II. Why on earth are there Nazis that are running this type of government-sponsored program? So that's where we go back to that historical information page that was in the back matter, and it talked about something called Project Paperclip. Guys, more often than I think I'm going to, I end up learning something when I read comics. And in this case, I read about some historical fact about my country that I did not know. This was a United States military project. Following the collapse of the Third Reich and the end of World War II, the United States wanted to take for itself and also keep out of the hands of the Soviets and any other potential enemies on the world stage as much technological advancement and weaponry as it could from Nazi Germany. But doing that in Project Paperclip included taking a whole bunch of Nazi scientists and bringing them here to the United States to have them work on U.S. government projects. This kept them out of the hands of other countries and also allowed the United States to benefit from innovation that had been developed during the Nazi regime. I could not believe this was true, and I had to go look it up. And as I looked around a little more, I actually discovered that Amazon Prime Video and the LA Times had produced a really interesting and informative podcast called Paperclip, America's Nazi Scientists, that was meant to be a complement to the Amazon Prime drama series Hunters, starring Al Pacino. I would encourage listeners to go check that out. It's a very interesting and upsetting part of American history, something that was new to me. So to go back to our fictional story, though, for just a minute, overall, this was a fun adventure. It had great art. We'll put some samples of that up on our Instagram account, @GraphicNovelApostle. I am really glad I had a chance to read this book. It was a fun story. It exposed me to something that I wouldn't have probably read otherwise. And I also learned a little bit about U.S. history that I did not know, and I think probably we should know more about. So as I mentioned earlier, I had a chance to speak to Amal Desai some about this book. And so I want to welcome now the co-creator of Jane Jett, Amal Desai. Amal, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on, Mark.
Oh, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about the genesis of Jane Jett. Where did this idea come from?
Yeah, so it was a long, winding path. Paul Essenson, the co-creator, and I first spoke last January, and we wanted to work together on a pitch. We decided to go with a public domain character just to save some time on design, because I was asking Paul to draw 7 pages in a cover, which is a big ask. We landed on Rocket Man and Rocket Girl, and I just didn't like the pairing of man and girl, so I changed it to Jane Jett. And basically what I wanted to do is create a pitch that, if it wasn't picked up, would still work as a short story. So those first 7 pages worked both ways. And then thankfully it got picked up, and then we built it out from there. So basically we did it in small batches of pages at a time. I would write the next 6 pages, discuss with Paul, and we would go from there. All the while, Paul was giving me a bunch of history lessons about the about the 50s, and I was doing a bunch of research, learned a lot, and we ended up building all of that into the story.
Now, the publisher of this book, Markosia, is not a publisher I was familiar with before. How did you find your way into their offices and come up with Jane Jett being published through this avenue?
As I'm sure many people do, I submitted my pitches to everyone on the planet. And luckily I stumbled upon Markosia from someone else looking for a publisher. It was just like a comment on Facebook or something like that. So I tracked them down, contacted them, and Harry Marcos from Markosia contacted me right away. And we went in depth on it, and that's why we ended up actually turning into a short graphic novel. Originally it was going to be a 6-issue series in 6-issue batches, sort of the conventional US route, but they actually publish only graphic novels in print. So we decided to go straight to a minimum of 44 pages. We ended up at 50, and it worked well. I mean, it was a huge undertaking for us to go with, but it worked well because we wanted to tell a full story in this first book. So sure, there's a lot more places it could go, but we wanted this to be a self-contained story.
Tell me about your partnership with Paul Essenson. How did you guys connect and decide that you all wanted to work together?
Basically, we found each other on the internet, on Facebook. We're both part of a group for drawing comics, and I saw him posting a ton of incredible drawings, and I couldn't believe that he wasn't working for Marvel or DC or even looking for paid work. He was just doing it for fun, just for himself. So I figured I'd reach out to him, see if he'd want to make the pitch together. If he's drawing anyways and I'm writing anyways, we might as well make something together. And thankfully, it really worked out. We get along very well, and he improves the book so much. I mean, there's some dialogue that's straight from him. We're like talking on the phone. I'm like, wait, say that again? What do you think? He's like, they should say something like blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh, that's perfect.
His art is wonderful.
Yeah, I think so too.
Especially for this superhero style of art with the thick, bold lines and just big full-page shots of the characters. Love the way the book looks and feels, really.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. And he choreographed all the fights, actually. For all the fight scenes, I would tell him, we have a page for this, and this is where it needs to start, this is where it needs to end. Or the last fight scene where it's 2.5 pages. And I just said like a list of 7 things needs to start here, and this is where we need to end. And then he came up with everything else. And he has a military background and much more experience in things like that. I've fought someone in like the 4th grade. So
how'd that turn out?
Much better. He takes care of that. I won, of course.
Of course you did. Good man. This is Jane Jett Book 1, Nuclear Shadows. How many more books do you have planned ahead?
Of course, it kind of depends on how successful this one is. And I think Markosia is open to continuing as long as we want to. If we're able to, if it's successful, I can keep going for forever. And I know Paul's interested in continuing to, but we really do need this one to, just sort of make it worth the time and effort. And in the meantime, Paul and I have actually started a separate book for project that'll be more streamlined, 20 pages, publish it right away. So we're going to do both concurrently.
So this is your first work as a comic author, correct?
That's correct.
Prior to that, though, you've done work as a letterer for comics. How did you get into that? And is that something as well that you're interested in looking to continue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm primarily a letterer. I've lettered a ton of indie books, and I think I'm most well known for that. And I'm slowly starting to work my way into writing. I picked up lettering a few years ago. I've been in graphic design and the print world for a while, and I love comics. So I found a way in. I picked up Nate Picos's book, Essential Guide to Comic Book Lettering, went through it like 3 times, and then found some work and just got to it.
Oh, that's fantastic. Completely self-taught then.
Yeah, and I've thankfully found a ton of work and a ton of great people. And I'm always looking for more work, even though I shouldn't be. I'm way overworked, but I always take on more. I haven't said no yet. Yeah, so I'll take any work that comes my way.
Well, that's great. And really completely coincidentally, as it turns out, 2 weeks ago on the show, we had Tommy Trembath on to talk about her book, When We Transform, and you did the lettering on that book.
Yeah, that book was amazing to work on, and Tommy's great to work with.
Now, where can people find you if they want to connect with you either for lettering work, for writing work, or just to check out what you've got going on?
Yeah, so the best way would be on Instagram. I am Comics by Amal Desai, Amaldesai. And my portfolio is out there somewhere. If you just Google my name, I think it'll come up. Thankfully, it's pretty rare.
If you had somebody who was interested in, they knew the premise of the book, they'd maybe even seen a little bit of the artwork, what would you want them to know going into the book?
Jane Jett is a book that is fast-paced, full of action sequences. We want to make it a ton of fun, and then we wanted to include a lot of depth in there with the real history, and there's some darker elements that people can relate to, but we didn't want that to weigh it down. So that's built into there, but really it's just a fun, quick read with a ton of action sequences with diesel punk styles that takes place in the 50s.
Well, fantastic. Jane Jett is available on Amazon either as a digital download for the Kindle or as a physical paperback copy. You can also get it at some other outlets, such as through Barnes & Noble, but I'm going to provide a link to this book on Amazon in the show notes. So if it sounds like something you're interested in checking out, that link will be available for you there. I want to thank everybody for listening once again this week. I want to thank Amal again for joining me. I look forward to seeing you all back next Monday, and as always, keep reading those comics.